I always believed Marcus was the perfect husband. 5 years of marriage, and he still brought me coffee every morning, remembered every anniversary, and never missed a chance to tell people how lucky he was to have me. Our friends envied what we had. Sarah would constantly joke about wanting to clone him for herself, and even my mother, who was notoriously hard to please, adored him. But perfection, I learned, is often just a carefully constructed mask. It started with small things that didn't quite add up. Marcus claimed he was working late more frequently, but when I called his office, his assistant would say he'd left hours ago. He became protective of his phone, taking it everywhere, even to the bathroom. When it buzzed during dinner, he'd glance at it with this strange expression, before quickly flipping it face down. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, this was Marcus, the man who proposed to me with a flash mob because he knew I loved grand gestures. The same man who learned to cook my grandmother's recipes when she passed away, because he knew they comforted me. The first real crack in my trust came on a Tuesday evening in March. Marcus said he had a client dinner and wouldn't be home until late. I decided to surprise him by cleaning out his home office, something I'd been meaning to do for weeks. While organizing his desk drawers, I found a credit card statement I'd never seen before. It was in his name, but not our joint account. The charges made my stomach drop. Expensive restaurants I'd never been to, hotel rooms in our own city, jewelry purchases from stores that definitely weren't for me since I'd received no gifts recently. My hands shook as I photographed each page with my phone. That night, I pretended to be asleep when Marcus came home. He slipped into bed quietly, and I could smell an unfamiliar perfume on his clothes. Not mine. Never mine. I lay there in the dark, my mind racing through every interaction, every late night, every business trip that now seemed suspicious. How long had this been going on? Who was she? How could I have been so blind? Hawkeye's to next few weeks were torture. I became a detective in my own marriage, checking his location on our shared phone plan, noting inconsistencies in his stories, watching for signs I'd missed before. I wanted to confront him immediately, but something held me back. Maybe it was the need to gather irrefutable evidence, or maybe I wasn't ready to face the complete destruction of everything I thought my life was. Marcus continued his charade flawlessly, bringing me flowers on Friday, suggesting we plan a vacation to Italy, telling me how much he loved me with the same conviction he'd always had. I hired a private investigator. I know how that sounds, how dramatic and desperate, but I needed proof. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I blew up our entire world. The investigator, a kind woman named Rebecca, who assured me she'd seen it all before, took the case. Within a week, she had photographs. Marcus entering a downtown apartment building, kissing a woman I didn't recognize, holding hands as they walked through the park where he'd proposed to me. The woman was beautiful, young, with long dark hair and a smile that made my chest ache with the unfairness of it all, but there was more. Rebecca's investigation revealed that this wasn't just an affair. Marcus had been living a double life for over 2 years. The woman, Jessica, thought she was his girlfriend. He'd told her he was divorced, that his ex-wife was bitter and made his life difficult, which was why he couldn't always be available. He'd even introduced her to some of his work colleagues, spinning elaborate stories about his single life. The apartment they met at? He was paying for it. The jewelry charges? Gifts for her. He'd created an entire alternate reality where I didn't exist. The most devastating discovery came when Rebecca showed me social media posts Jessica had made, talking about her wonderful boyfriend Marcus and their plans for the future. She'd posted photos of gifts he'd given her, including a necklace remarkably similar to one he'd given me for our last anniversary. In her posts, she gushed about how honest and genuine he was, how refreshing it was to date someone who wasn't playing games. The irony was suffocating. I spent 3 days deciding what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to confront Marcus privately, to give him a chance to explain, though I couldn't imagine what explanation could possibly justify the elaborate deception. But a bigger part of me, the part that was furious and hurt and tired of being made a fool of, wanted him to face consequences that matched the magnitude of his betrayal. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Marcus announced that he wanted to throw a party for my birthday, invite all our friends and family to celebrate together. He seemed so excited about it, so proud of himself for planning this surprise that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Instead, I smiled and told him it sounded perfect. I even helped him plan it, suggesting he invite everyone we knew, all our mutual friends, his colleagues, even his parents who lived across the country. I wanted a big audience for what I had planned. The night of the party, our house was filled with laughter and conversation. Marcus was in his element, playing the perfect host, his arm around my waist as he told everyone how lucky he was to be married to such an amazing woman. I watched him perform, marveling at how natural he seemed, how effortlessly he lied to every single person in that room. His parents beamed with pride at their son, his boss complimented him on his work-life balance, and our friends raised toasts to our beautiful marriage. When it came time for the traditional birthday speech, Marcus clinked his glass and called for everyone's attention. He launched into a heartfelt monologue about love, commitment, and honesty in marriage. He talked about how marriage required trust and communication, how couples needed to be transparent with each other to make it work. The whole time I stood beside him, smiling, waiting for my moment. When he finished, everyone applauded and he kissed my cheek, whispering how much he loved me. Then I took the microphone. Das Eiling, EF Abald, Irrentable. I thanked everyone for coming and told them how much their friendship meant to me. I talked about how important honesty was in relationships, echoing Marcus's words. I could see him relaxing, probably thinking I was going to give some sweet speech about our marriage. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope. I told our guests that I had recently learned some interesting things about my husband, and since he'd just spoken so eloquently about honesty and marriage, I thought it would be the perfect time to share them. The room grew quiet, sensing something was about to happen. Marcus's face went pale, and he tried to take the microphone from me, but I stepped away. I read aloud from the credit card statements, describing the hotel visits and restaurant charges to places we'd never been together. I mentioned the apartment he was paying for and asked if anyone could help me understand why my devoted husband might need a second residence. The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus kept trying to interrupt, saying we should discuss this privately, but I continued. Then I brought out the photographs. I didn't show them to everyone, but I described them in detail. I talked about Jessica, about how she believed Marcus was divorced, about the elaborate stories he'd told her about his bitter ex-wife. I mentioned the social media posts where she talked about her honest, genuine boyfriend who would never lie to her. Several people gasped audibly. Marcus's mother started crying, and his father looked like he might be sick. I saved the best for last. I pulled out my phone and played a voicemail Marcus had left for Jessica just 2 days earlier, talking about how he couldn't wait to start their life together properly once he figured out how to handle his divorce situation. His own voice filled our living room, telling another woman he loved her while standing next to his actual wife at his actual wife's birthday party. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Marcus tried to deny everything, then tried to minimize it, then finally just stood there looking lost and broken. His parents left immediately, his mother sobbing about how they'd raised him better than this. His colleagues made awkward excuses and departed quickly, probably already calculating how this scandal might affect their own reputations. Our friends were divided between those who immediately rallied around me and those who seemed uncomfortable with the public nature of the revelation. Sarah was the first to speak after I finished. She looked directly at Marcus and said she always thought he was too good to be true, and now she knew why. Others began sharing their own suspicions, little things they'd noticed but dismissed. Apparently, several people had seen him around town with Jessica, but assumed she was a work colleague or client. One couple mentioned seeing him at a restaurant across town, acting very intimate with a woman who wasn't me, but they'd convinced themselves they must have been mistaken. Marcus finally found his voice and begged me to let him explain, to give him a chance to make things right. He said he loved me, that Jessica didn't mean anything, that he'd made terrible mistakes but wanted to fix them. The desperation in his voice was real, but it was too late. Far too late. I told him he'd had plenty of chances to be honest, plenty of opportunities to choose his marriage over his lies. Instead, He'd chosen to deceive everyone who cared about him, including the woman he claimed to love. The party ended with Marcus packing a bag and leaving for his brother's house. Before he left, he tried one more time to apologize, to explain that he never meant for things to go so far, that he'd gotten in too deep and didn't know how to get out. I listened to his excuses, his promises to change, his pleas for forgiveness, and felt nothing but relief that I no longer had to pretend to believe him. The news of our spectacular breakup spread quickly through our social circle and beyond. Marcus's affair became the talk of his office, affecting his professional reputation. Jessica, upon learning the truth about his marriage, posted her own social media revelation, calling him a pathological liar and warning other women about his behavior. The apartment he'd been paying for became a liability he couldn't afford, and the financial strain of maintaining his double life while facing divorce proceedings hit him hard. I filed for divorce immediately, and thanks to the evidence I'd gathered, the proceedings went smoothly. The prenup we'd signed protected some of my assets, but more importantly, his documented infidelity and deception made it clear that our marriage was irretrievably broken due to his actions. I kept the house, most of our savings, and my dignity intact. Months later, I learned that Marcus had tried to reconcile with Jessica, apparently believing that since his marriage was over anyway, they might as well be together. She wanted nothing to do with him, unable to trust anything he said after discovering the extent of his deception. He'd lost both relationships and found himself alone, exactly as he'd always told Jessica he was, except now it was actually true. The most satisfying part wasn't his downfall, though. It was the freedom I felt once the truth was out. No more wondering why his stories didn't add up. No more second-guessing my instincts. No more pretending everything was perfect when it clearly wasn't. I realized how exhausting it had been to live with someone who was constantly lying, even when I didn't consciously know it was happening. Our mutual friends eventually sorted themselves out. The ones who truly cared about me remained close, while others who were more loyal to Marcus or uncomfortable with drama faded away. I was fine with that. I learned who my real friends were, and discovered I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. The woman who'd been too trusting, too willing to give the benefit of the doubt, was gone. In her place was someone who trusted her instincts and refused to accept anything less than complete honesty. A year later, I ran into Marcus at a coffee shop downtown. He looked older, tired, and when he saw me, his face showed a mixture of shame and longing. He asked if we could talk, if there was any chance we could work things out. I looked at this man I'd once planned to spend my life with, this person who'd shared my bed and my dreams while living an entirely separate existence, and felt nothing but pity. I told him there was nothing to discuss, that he'd made his choices and would have to live with the consequences. As I walked away, I thought about the birthday party that had changed everything. Some people had criticized me for handling it so publicly, saying I should have confronted him privately first. But I realized that Marcus's betrayal hadn't been private. He'd involved our entire social circle in his deception, using our friends as unwitting accomplices to his lies. Everyone who'd believed his perfect husband act, who'd envied our relationship, who'd been told stories about his devoted marriage while he was actually cheating, deserved to know the truth. He thought I'd never find out, banking on my trust and his ability to compartmentalize his life. He believed he could keep his two worlds separate indefinitely, that he was smart enough to maintain his elaborate deception forever. But the truth has a way of surfacing, and lies require too much energy to sustain. Eventually, the weight of his dishonesty collapsed on itself, taking our marriage and his reputation down with it. Now everyone knows his secrets, and he has to live with the knowledge that his own choices destroyed everything he claimed to value. The perfect husband facade is gone forever, replaced by the reality of who he really was all along. And me? I'm building a new life based on authenticity, surrounded by people who value honesty as much as I do. It turns out that losing a lying husband was the best thing that ever happened to me. The weeks following the party revelation brought a cascade of discoveries I never could have anticipated. Rebecca, my private investigator, called me 3 days after the confrontation with information that made Marcus's betrayal seem even more extensive than I'd originally thought. While conducting her investigation, She'd uncovered evidence suggesting that Jessica wasn't his first affair. There had been others, a pattern of deception that stretched back almost to the beginning of our marriage. The first was a woman named Claire, a colleague from his previous job. Their relationship had lasted 8 months, overlapping with our engagement period. Rebecca had found deleted emails in a recovered backup of his old laptop. Emails where Marcus complained about feeling trapped by his upcoming wedding but unable to break it off because too much money had been spent on deposits. He'd written to Claire about how he wished he'd met her sooner, how different his life might have been. Reading those emails felt like being punched in the stomach repeatedly. Our beautiful engagement, the time I'd thought was the happiest of our life together, had been a lie from the start. Then there was Amanda, a client's assistant he'd been involved with during our second year of marriage. This affair had been brief but intense, consisting mainly of lunch meetings that turned into hotel encounters. Rebecca found credit card charges for jewelry that I'd never received, gifts that must have been for Amanda. The timeline coincided with a period when Marcus had been particularly attentive to me at home, planning surprise dates and bringing me flowers weekly. I realized now that his extra affection had been guilt-driven, his way of compensating for his betrayal. But the revelation that truly shattered any remaining sympathy I might have had for Marcus came when Rebecca discovered he'd been using online dating platforms throughout our entire marriage. Not just one, but multiple sites, with detailed profiles describing himself as single and looking for serious relationships. He'd been going on dates, sleeping with women, and building emotional connections while coming home to me every night. The scope of his deception was breathtaking in its completeness. I decided to reach out to Jessica directly. I knew it might seem vindictive, but I felt she deserved to know the full extent of what Marcus had done to both of us. We met at a small cafe across town, and I was struck by how similar we looked. Not identically, but we shared the same general build, similar hair color, and even dressed in comparable styles. It was unsettling to realize Marcus seemed to have a type, and we both fit it perfectly. Jessica was devastated but grateful for the information. She told me she'd been planning to give Marcus an ultimatum about finally getting divorced and making their relationship official. She'd even been looking at wedding venues, imagining a future with a man who was never actually available. The cruelest part was that Marcus had been giving her a timeline, telling her his divorce would be finalized by the end of the year, encouraging her to be patient just a little longer. During our conversation, Jessica revealed details about their relationship that made me physically ill. Marcus had taken her to restaurants we'd been to together, telling her they were new discoveries. He'd given her jewelry almost identical to pieces he'd bought me, apparently recycling not just his lies but his romantic gestures. Most painfully, he'd told her many of the same stories about his childhood, his dreams, and his values that he'd shared with me early in our relationship. I realized that even his personality might have been partially fabricated, a carefully crafted persona designed to attract and keep women. Jessica and I compared notes and discovered that Marcus had been using the same excuses with both of us. When he was late coming home to me, he'd told her he was stuck in traffic or dealing with work emergencies. When he couldn't see her on weekends, he'd blamed family obligations or his fictional bitter ex-wife's demands. He'd managed to keep us both satisfied with his attention by making each of us feel like we were the priority while actually prioritizing neither of us. The professional fallout for Marcus was swift and severe. His boss, who had been at the party, called him into a meeting the Monday after my revelation. While the company couldn't fire him for his personal conduct, they could question his judgment and reliability. Marcus worked in financial planning, a field where trust and integrity were paramount. Clients began requesting different advisors, not wanting to work with someone whose personal life suggested an inability to make sound decisions or honor commitments. His colleague, James, who had also attended the party, later told me that the office atmosphere became incredibly uncomfortable for Marcus. People whispered when he walked by, and several female employees complained to HR about feeling unsafe around someone who had demonstrated such capacity for deception. While no formal action was taken, Marcus was gradually excluded from important meetings and high-profile client interactions. His career trajectory, once promising, stalled completely. Marcus's family was perhaps even more devastated than I was. His parents had flown in from Oregon for the party, expecting to celebrate their son's happy marriage. Instead, they witnessed the complete destruction of everything they thought they knew about him. His mother called me several times in the weeks following, apologizing profusely and asking if there was anything she could do to help with the divorce proceedings. She was horrified that she'd raised someone capable of such sustained deception. His father took a different approach, trying to understand how his son had become someone so fundamentally dishonest. He visited Marcus repeatedly, attempting to get him into therapy and demanding explanations for his behavior. According to Marcus's brother David, these conversations were brutal, with their father expressing disappointment that went beyond the affair to encompass the systematic lying and manipulation Marcus had employed. The divorce proceedings revealed even more disturbing information. Marcus had been hiding money in accounts I didn't know about, presumably to fund his double life, but possibly also to keep assets away from me in case of divorce. My lawyer discovered that he'd taken out a loan against his 401k without my knowledge, despite us being married in a community property state where such decisions should have been joint. The financial investigation showed that he'd been planning for the possibility of our marriage ending for quite some time, which suggested a level of premeditation that was chilling. During the deposition, Marcus's lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive for exposing his affairs so publicly. They argued that I'd humiliated him unnecessarily and damaged his reputation beyond repair. My lawyer countered by pointing out that Marcus had damaged his own reputation through his actions, and that I had simply revealed the truth about behavior that had been ongoing for years. The judge seemed unimpressed with Marcus's claims of victimhood, particularly when presented with evidence of the financial deception. Marcus attempted to reach out to me multiple times during this period, sometimes through mutual friends, sometimes directly. He sent long emails explaining his behavior, claiming he'd been suffering from depression and had made terrible decisions while not thinking clearly. He promised therapy, medication, whatever it would take to become the husband I deserved. He even sent flowers to my office with notes begging for another chance. I never responded to any of his attempts at contact. My therapist, Dr. Morgan, helped me understand that engaging with Marcus would only give him hope for reconciliation and make it harder for both of us to move forward. She also helped me process the complex emotions I was experiencing, including unexpected grief for the marriage I'd thought I had and anger at myself for missing so many warning signs. The therapy sessions revealed that I'd been subconsciously adapting to Marcus's deception for years. I'd been making excuses for inconsistencies in his stories, filling in gaps in his explanations, and generally working overtime to maintain my belief in our perfect marriage. Dr. Morgan explained that this was common in relationships with pathological liars, where the honest partner gradually takes on the responsibility of making the dishonest partner's stories make sense. 6 months after the party, I learned that Marcus had lost his job. The combination of client complaints, office tension, and a general loss of confidence from his superiors had led to his termination. He tried to start his own financial planning practice, but word of his personal conduct had spread throughout the industry. Professional networks that had once welcomed him were now closed to him, and building a client base from scratch seemed impossible given his reputation. Jessica contacted me again during this time to let me know that Marcus had been trying to rebuild their relationship. He'd reached out to her repeatedly, claiming that losing his job had made him realize what was truly important and that he wanted to start fresh with her. She'd considered it briefly, she admitted, because their connection had felt so real despite being built on lies. But ultimately, she couldn't trust anything he said, and she'd blocked him on all platforms. This rejection seemed to break something in Marcus. David, his brother, called to let me know that Marcus had been staying with him, but had become increasingly unstable. He wasn't eating properly, wasn't looking for work, and spent most of his time obsessing over ways to win back either Jessica or me. David was concerned about his mental state and had convinced him to see a therapist, but Marcus had only attended 2 sessions before quitting. The most unexpected development came when I received a call from a woman named Patricia, who identified herself as Marcus's ex-girlfriend from college. She'd heard about our divorce through mutual acquaintances and wanted to share information that she thought might be helpful. We met for coffee, and Patricia told me a story that provided disturbing context for Marcus's behavior during our marriage. According to Patricia, Marcus had cheated on her throughout their 3-year relationship in college. But more than that, he'd been skilled at manipulation and gaslighting, making her question her own perceptions when she suspected his infidelity. He'd convinced her that she was paranoid and jealous, that her suspicions were damaging their relationship. She'd eventually caught him in bed with another woman in their shared apartment, but even then, he'd tried to convince her that what she was seeing wasn't what it appeared to be. Patricia's story made me realize that Marcus's behavior wasn't the result of a midlife crisis or temporary lapse in judgment. He'd been a serial cheater and manipulator for decades, possibly his entire adult life. Our marriage hadn't changed him or inspired him to become a better person. He'd simply become more sophisticated in his deception techniques. This revelation was simultaneously devastating and liberating. Devastating because it confirmed that our entire relationship had been built on false premises, but liberating because it removed any lingering doubt about whether I'd made the right decision in divorcing him. There was no version of Marcus that was capable of fidelity or honesty. The man I'd fallen in love with had never actually existed. I began to rebuild my social life, reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage and making new ones through various activities. I joined a hiking group, started taking pottery classes, and even tried online dating eventually. The contrast between these honest, straightforward interactions and the complicated deceptions I'd lived with for years was striking. I'd forgotten how simple relationships could be when both people were telling the truth. The hiking group became particularly important to my healing process. Every Saturday, we'd explore different trails around the state, and the physical challenge combined with the natural beauty helped clear my mind of the anger and hurt that had consumed me for months. One of the regular hikers, a divorced teacher named Kevin, became a close friend and eventually something more. What struck me most about Kevin was his transparency. He talked openly about his failed marriage, his mistakes, and his hopes for the future. After years of Marcus's carefully constructed facade, Kevin's honesty was refreshing and attractive. A year after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Marcus's mother at a grocery store. She looked older, worn down by the stress of watching her son's life implode. She apologized again for his behavior and told me she still considered me a daughter-in-law in her heart. She also shared that Marcus had finally started taking therapy seriously and was working on understanding why he'd been so destructive in his relationships. According to his mother, the therapist had diagnosed Marcus with narcissistic personality disorder and was working with him on developing empathy and honest communication skills. She seemed cautiously hopeful that he might eventually become a better person, though she acknowledged that the damage he'd done to his relationships and reputation might be irreversible. She asked if I might consider speaking with him as part of his recovery process, but I declined. My healing didn't require his redemption, and I had no interest in becoming part of his therapeutic journey. The financial settlement from our divorce allowed me to make some changes I'd been considering for years. I'd always wanted to travel, but Marcus had preferred familiar destinations and predictable vacations. I booked a month-long trip to Southeast Asia, something he would have found too adventurous and unstructured. Traveling alone was initially intimidating, but it became an incredible experience of independence and self-discovery. In Thailand, I met a group of women who were also traveling solo, and we ended up exploring together for 2 weeks. Hearing their stories of relationships, careers, and personal growth helped me gain perspective on my own experience. One woman, Sarah from Australia, had also been through a difficult divorce involving infidelity, and her insights into the recovery process were invaluable. She helped me understand that the betrayal I'd experienced said nothing about my worth as a person and everything about Marcus's character defects. When I returned from the trip, I felt genuinely happy for the first time in years. The constant underlying anxiety I'd lived with during my marriage, the feeling that something was always slightly off, even when I couldn't identify what it was, had completely disappeared. I realized that on some level I'd been aware of Marcus's deception, even when I couldn't consciously acknowledge it, and that awareness had created a persistent tension that I'd attributed to normal stress. 2 years post-divorce, I heard through mutual friends that Marcus had moved to another state and was working in a completely different field. Apparently, his reputation in financial services had been so damaged that he'd been unable to find employment anywhere in our region. He was reportedly working for a small insurance company, a significant step down from his previous position, and was dating someone new. I felt no satisfaction in hearing about his reduced circumstances, just a mild curiosity about whether he was being honest with his new girlfriend. My relationship with Kevin had developed into something serious and stable. What I appreciated most about him was that our relationship progressed naturally, without the dramatic gestures and overwhelming romance that had characterized my early relationship with Marcus. Kevin's love felt steady and real, based on who I actually was rather than who he imagined me to be or wanted me to become. We talked about everything, including our past relationships, and I never had to wonder whether he was telling me the truth. The contrast between my marriage to Marcus and my relationship with Kevin highlighted how abnormal my previous situation had been. With Kevin, I didn't need to be a detective, analyzing his stories for consistency, or wondering why his explanations didn't quite add up. I didn't have to make excuses for his behavior to friends or family. I didn't have to work constantly to maintain the illusion of a perfect relationship, because our relationship, while not perfect, was honest and healthy. Jessica and I had maintained occasional contact, and she'd eventually started dating someone new as well. Her boyfriend was recently divorced and completely transparent about his past, his finances, and his intentions. Like me, she'd learned to value honesty above charm, and stability above excitement. We'd both become much better at recognizing red flags and trusting our instincts when something felt off. The birthday party that had ended my marriage became legendary in our social circle, referenced whenever someone needed to make a point about the importance of confronting difficult truths. Some people still thought I'd been too harsh in my approach, but most understood that the public nature of Marcus's deception had warranted a public revelation. My friends who had been there still talked about the moment when the perfect facade cracked completely, and how obvious it became in retrospect that something had always been wrong with our seemingly ideal marriage. Looking back, I could see warning signs I'd missed or dismissed throughout our relationship. Marcus had always been slightly too interested in controlling the narrative of our social interactions, steering conversations away from topics that might expose inconsistencies in his stories. He'd been unusually skilled at deflecting personal questions and turning discussions back to other people. He'd also been remarkably good at making me feel special and chosen, which I now understood was a manipulation technique designed to keep me invested in the relationship despite my subconscious concerns. The experience taught me that intuition is often more reliable than evidence, especially when someone is skilled at creating false evidence. I'd felt that something was wrong for months before I found proof, but I'd dismissed those feelings because I couldn't substantiate them. In future relationships, I promised myself I would trust my instincts more readily and demand transparency from the beginning rather than hoping for it to develop over time. 3 years after the divorce, I received an unexpected letter from Marcus. It was lengthy and detailed, part confession and part apology. He acknowledged the extent of his deception, taking responsibility for the pain he'd caused not just me but Jessica and all the other women he'd involved in his web of lies. He explained that therapy had helped him understand that his behavior stemmed from deep-seated insecurity and a fear of genuine intimacy, which had led him to create multiple superficial relationships rather than investing honestly in one meaningful connection. The letter was well written and seemed sincere, but I felt nothing while reading it except a distant curiosity about the person he might be becoming. His apology, while perhaps therapeutic for him, didn't change anything about my life or my healing process. I appreciated that he'd taken responsibility for his actions, but I had no interest in absolving him or providing closure for his guilt. I filed the letter away and didn't respond. Was she no? My life had become full and satisfying in ways that had nothing to do with Marcus or our failed marriage. I'd been promoted at work, had developed strong friendships, and was in a relationship that brought me joy rather than anxiety. I'd learned to live authentically, surrounding myself with people who valued honesty and emotional availability. The woman who had once believed that love required constant vigilance and interpretation had been replaced by someone who understood that healthy love was supposed to feel safe and uncomplicated. The story of my marriage and divorce had become a cautionary tale among my friends and colleagues, but also a story of empowerment and recovery. I'd shown that it was possible to discover the truth, confront deception, and rebuild a better life. Women going through similar situations sometimes reached out to me for advice, and I always told them the same thing. Trust your instincts, gather evidence if you need it, and don't be afraid to demand the truth, even if it destroys everything you thought you knew. Marcus thought I'd never find out, banking on my love and trust to keep his secrets safe. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and lies require too much energy to maintain indefinitely. Now everyone knows what kind of person he really was, and I've learned what kind of person I really am when faced with betrayal and the need to rebuild. The perfect husband turned out to be perfectly false, but the experience of uncovering his deception and starting over turned out to be perfectly worthwhile. The ripple effects of that birthday party revelation continued to spread far beyond what I'd initially anticipated. About 4 years after the divorce, I learned that Marcus's deception had influenced several other marriages in our social circle. Couples who had once held us up as relationship goals began questioning their own partnerships more seriously, leading to some uncomfortable but necessary conversations about honesty and fidelity. My friend Rachel confided that watching Marcus's double life unravel had prompted her to confront her own husband about suspicious behavior she'd been ignoring for months. It turned out he'd been having an emotional affair with a coworker, nothing as extensive as Marcus's betrayals, but significant enough to require serious marriage counseling. Rachel credited my willingness to face the truth publicly with giving her the courage to demand honesty in her own relationship. They worked through their issues and emerged stronger, but she always said she might have continued living in denial if she hadn't witnessed the spectacular implosion of what everyone thought was the perfect marriage. Another couple, Tom and Lisa, actually divorced within a year of the party. Seeing how skillfully Marcus had deceived everyone made Lisa realize that her husband's constant business trips and secretive phone calls might not be as innocent as she'd assumed. Her investigation revealed a pattern of affairs that had been ongoing for years, though not with the same methodical deception that Marcus had employed. Tom had simply been careless rather than calculating, but the betrayal was just as devastating. The most unexpected consequence came when Jessica reached out to me with information that completely recontextualized everything I thought I knew about Marcus's psychology. She'd been contacted by another woman, someone named Diana, who had been involved with Marcus during the early years of our marriage. Diana had seen Jessica's social media posts about their relationship and Marcus's deception, and she'd decided to come forward with her own story. Diana's account was disturbing in its implications. She revealed that Marcus hadn't just been cheating. He'd been systematically studying the women he was involved with, learning their vulnerabilities and insecurities, then using that information to manipulate them more effectively. He'd kept detailed notes on his phone about each woman's emotional triggers, their relationship histories, and their fears. Diana had discovered these notes when Marcus accidentally left his phone unlocked during one of their encounters. According to Diana, Marcus had profiles on each of his targets that read like psychological assessments. For me, he'd noted my desire for stability after my parents' contentious divorce, my tendency to avoid conflict, and my need for reassurance about being loved. For Jessica, he'd identified her fear of abandonment stemming from her father leaving when she was young, her insecurity about her career prospects, and her desire for someone who seemed successful and established. He'd been playing each of us like instruments, pushing exactly the right emotional buttons to keep us invested and compliant. This revelation was perhaps more disturbing than the affairs themselves. It suggested that Marcus wasn't just a weak man who'd made bad choices, but someone who deliberately exploited women's emotional vulnerabilities for his own gratification. The level of premeditation and psychological manipulation involved painted a picture of someone who was genuinely dangerous in relationships, not just unfaithful. Diana also shared that Marcus had talked about his, quote, system for managing multiple relationships, treating it almost like a business operation. He'd had spreadsheets tracking where he'd taken each woman, what gifts he'd given them, and what stories he'd told them to avoid contradictions. He'd rotated restaurants and hotels to minimize the chance of running into someone he knew with the wrong woman. He'd even had different personas for different relationships, adjusting his personality to match what each woman seemed to want. Learning about this systematic approach to deception made me realize that I'd never really known Marcus at all. The man I'd married had been a carefully constructed character designed to appeal to my specific psychological profile. Every shared moment, every intimate conversation, every expression of love had been calculated and strategic rather than genuine. It was like discovering that I'd been married to an actor who'd never broken character, even in private. I shared this information with Dr. Morgan during our continued therapy sessions. She explained that Marcus's behavior suggested sociopathic tendencies, particularly the lack of empathy required to systematically manipulate multiple people without apparent guilt or remorse. She helped me understand that people like Marcus often target empathetic, trusting individuals because they're easier to manipulate and less likely to question inconsistencies in behavior or stories. The knowledge that I'd been specifically targeted rather than randomly victimized was oddly comforting. It meant that my trust and love hadn't been misplaced due to poor judgment on my part, but rather because I'd been deliberately deceived by someone skilled in manipulation. Dr. Morgan emphasized that being targeted by a manipulator was actually a testament to my positive qualities, not evidence of any personal failings. Kevin, who had become my fiancé by this point, was incredibly supportive as I processed these new revelations about Marcus. He had been patient and understanding about my need to fully understand what had happened in my marriage before I could completely move forward. Kevin's transparency about his own past and his willingness to discuss difficult topics had been crucial in helping me learn to trust again. Our relationship had progressed slowly and deliberately, with both of us committed to building something honest and sustainable. Kevin had been through his own painful divorce, though his ex-wife's issues were related to alcoholism rather than infidelity. He understood the importance of taking time to heal and the value of complete honesty in building a new relationship. We'd attended couples counseling together even before getting engaged, wanting to establish healthy communication patterns from the beginning. The wedding planning process was completely different from my experience with Marcus. Where Marcus had wanted an elaborate, expensive celebration designed to impress our guests, Kevin and I planned a simple ceremony focused on the commitment we were making to each other. We kept the guest list small, inviting only people who had supported us through our individual healing journeys. Several friends who had been at the infamous birthday party were there, and they commented on how different I seemed, how much more relaxed and genuinely happy I appeared. Marcus's brother David attended the wedding, which surprised me. He'd maintained contact despite everything that had happened, and he'd become friends with Kevin through shared interests in hiking and photography. David told me that he barely recognized his brother anymore, that the confident, charismatic person Marcus had once been had been replaced by someone who seemed lost and uncertain about everything. He'd moved again, this time to a small town in Montana, and was working as a clerk in a hardware store. The dramatic downfall from successful financial advisor to retail employee served as a stark reminder of how completely his deception had destroyed his life. 5 years after the divorce, I received another unexpected contact, this time from Marcus's therapist. She reached out through my lawyer, requesting permission to discuss Marcus's case as part of a research study she was conducting on pathological lying and its impact on relationships. I agreed to participate, curious about what insights psychological research might provide about my experience. Dr. Patricia Williams, Marcus's therapist, was studying patterns of deceptive behavior in relationships and their long-term consequences for both perpetrators and victims. She explained that Marcus's case was particularly interesting because of the systematic nature of his deception and the comprehensive documentation of his manipulative techniques. The notes Diana had discovered provided researchers with rare insight into the mind of someone who approached relationships as strategic games rather than emotional connections. According to Dr. Williams, Marcus had made significant progress in therapy, developing what appeared to be genuine remorse for his actions and some capacity for empathy that had been largely absent before. However, she was careful to emphasize that personality disorders like the one Marcus exhibited were extremely difficult to treat, and that the changes he'd made might not be permanent or complete. She warned that people like Marcus often learn to mimic appropriate emotional responses without actually experiencing them authentically. The research interview process was therapeutic for me in unexpected ways. Discussing the details of Marcus's manipulation with someone who understood the psychological mechanisms involved helped me process the experience more completely. Dr. Williams confirmed that my instincts about something being wrong in the marriage had been accurate, even when I couldn't identify specific problems. She explained that victims of systematic manipulation often experience chronic low-level anxiety because their subconscious minds detect inconsistencies that their conscious minds can't quite grasp. My participation in the study also connected me with other women who had experienced similar situations, Dr. Williams organized a support group for people who had been victimized by partners with personality disorders, and attending those meetings was incredibly validating. Hearing other women describe the same subtle signs of manipulation, the same gradual erosion of self-trust, and the same difficulty convincing others that their seemingly perfect partners were actually deceptive helped me understand that my experience wasn't unique or particularly dramatic. One woman in the group, Maria, had been married to a man who had maintained 3 separate families in different cities for over a decade. Another, Jennifer, had discovered that her husband had been running elaborate financial scams while presenting himself as a successful businessman. Each story was different in its details but similar in the systematic nature of the deception and the psychological impact on the victims. The support group also helped me recognize how much I'd grown and healed since my divorce. While the other women were still struggling with trust issues and emotional recovery, I'd successfully rebuilt my life and formed healthy relationships. My marriage to Kevin was approaching its 2nd anniversary, and we'd started discussing having children together. The idea of bringing a child into a relationship based on honesty and mutual respect felt completely different from the uncertainty I'd felt about starting a family with Marcus. Kevin and I did have a daughter, Emma, 2 years after our wedding. Becoming a mother while in a healthy relationship highlighted even more starkly how wrong my marriage to Marcus had been. Kevin was present and engaged from the moment we started trying to conceive, sharing every aspect of the pregnancy and parenting journey. There were no mysterious absences, no phone calls he couldn't take in front of me, no compartmentalized aspects of his life that I wasn't allowed to access. Watching Kevin interact with Emma also showed me what genuine love looked like. His affection for our daughter was spontaneous and unconditional, based on who she was rather than how she made him look to others. I realized that Marcus's expressions of love had always been performative, designed to reinforce his image as a devoted husband rather than arising from genuine emotional connection. When Emma was 6 months old, I received a Facebook friend request from Marcus. I stared at his profile photo for a long time, noting how much older he looked, how the confident smile I remembered had been replaced by something more tentative and uncertain. I declined the request without hesitation, but the attempt at contact made me realize how completely I'd moved on from that chapter of my life. I felt no anger, no curiosity about his current situation, no desire for any kind of connection. He'd become irrelevant to my happiness and well-being. Kevin found me looking at Marcus's profile and asked if I was okay. I told him about the friend request and my complete lack of emotional response to it. Kevin smiled and said that was probably the healthiest possible reaction, that indifference was the opposite of love, much more than hatred was. His insight reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him, his ability to understand emotional complexity and respond with wisdom rather than jealousy or insecurity. Our daughter's first birthday party was a joyful celebration with close friends and family. As I looked around at the genuine relationships we'd built, the honest connections and authentic love surrounding our family, I thought about the contrast with the elaborate deceptions that had characterized my previous life. Emma would grow up seeing what healthy relationships looked like, understanding that love was supposed to feel safe and uncomplicated, rather than anxious and uncertain. Several friends who had been at both the infamous birthday party that ended my marriage and Emma's first birthday party commented on the difference in atmosphere. The earlier event had been tense even before my revelation, charged with unspoken tensions and performed happiness. Emma's party was relaxed and genuine, filled with people who actually cared about each other rather than maintaining social appearances. Sarah, my friend who had joked about wanting to clone Marcus, apologized again for not seeing through his act earlier. She'd become much more skeptical of seemingly perfect relationships, she told me, and had learned to value authenticity over charm in her own dating life. She'd recently started seeing someone who was kind and reliable but not particularly smooth or impressive, and she was discovering that those qualities were much more valuable in a long-term partner than the dramatic romance she'd once thought she wanted. The 7th anniversary of the birthday party revelation passed without me even noticing until Kevin mentioned it a few days later. The date that had once felt like a watershed moment in my life had become just another day, no longer significant enough to mark on my mental calendar. That realization felt like the final confirmation that I'd completely healed from the trauma of Marcus's betrayal and moved on to a healthier, happier life. I occasionally wondered what had become of Jessica and the other women Marcus had deceived, hoping they'd found the same peace and genuine love that I'd discovered. Through social media, I learned that Jessica had gotten married to the honest, recently divorced man she'd been dating, and she looked genuinely happy in her wedding photos. Diana had started a blog about recognizing manipulation in relationships, using her experience with Marcus to help other women identify red flags earlier in the process. My relationship with Marcus's family had evolved into something unexpectedly positive. His mother still sent birthday cards to Emma and Christmas gifts to Kevin and me. She'd completely cut ties with Marcus after learning the full extent of his deception, unable to reconcile the son she'd raised with the man he'd become. His father had died 2 years earlier, and I'd attended the funeral to support his mother, sitting with the family despite the awkwardness of Marcus's presence. Marcus had looked terrible at his father's funeral, older than his years, and visibly struggling with addiction issues. David later told me that Marcus had developed problems with alcohol and prescription drugs, unable to cope with the complete destruction of his previous life. The confident, successful man who had once seemed to have everything under control had been revealed as deeply troubled and fundamentally unstable. The contrast between Marcus's downward spiral and my upward trajectory was stark, but not particularly satisfying. I'd moved beyond needing his suffering to validate my own healing. His consequences were the natural result of his choices, just as my happiness was the result of my decision to face the truth and rebuild authentically. We'd both created the lives we were living through our responses to the crisis his deception had caused. Emma's second birthday was approaching, and I found myself reflecting on how different my life might have been if I'd never discovered Marcus's affairs. I might still be living in denial, raising a child in a household built on lies, teaching her that relationships required constant vigilance and interpretation, rather than trust and transparency. The pain of discovery and divorce had been excruciating at the time, but it had led to a life that was infinitely better than the false happiness I'd been settling for. Dr. Morgan, who I still saw occasionally for maintenance sessions, helped me understand that my experience with Marcus had actually made me a stronger person and better partner. The skills I developed in recognizing manipulation and trusting my instincts served me well in all areas of life, not just romantic relationships. I'd become more assertive at work, more selective about friendships, and more confident in my judgment about people and situations. The support group Dr. Williams had organized continued to meet regularly, and I occasionally attended as a success story for newer members who were still struggling with the aftermath of their own experiences with deceptive partners. Sharing my journey from devastation to genuine happiness gave hope to women who couldn't imagine ever trusting again or finding healthy love. One new group member, a woman named Carol, whose husband had been leading a double life for 15 years, broke down crying when I described my current marriage to Kevin. She couldn't believe that relationships could actually be as straightforward and honest as I described, that love could feel secure rather than anxious. I assured her that while the healing process was difficult and lengthy, it was absolutely possible to rebuild and find something better than what she'd lost. My story had become something of a legend, not just in our social circle, but in the broader community of people recovering from relationships with manipulative partners. The birthday party confrontation was often cited as an example of how to handle the discovery of systematic deception, though I always emphasized that public exposure wasn't right for everyone, and that the most important thing was prioritizing one's own safety and healing. Looking back, I could see that Marcus's greatest mistake hadn't been underestimating my ability to discover his deception, but rather underestimating my strength to survive its revelation and build something better from the ruins. He'd thought I was weak and dependent, someone who would accept any treatment rather than face the pain of losing him. Instead, I'd proven to be resilient and capable of creating a life that was far superior to anything I'd had with him. The woman who had once been willing to ignore her instincts to preserve a false sense of security had been transformed into someone who demanded authenticity and refused to accept anything less than genuine love and respect. Marcus thought I'd never find out his secrets, but discovering them had been the beginning of finding myself. Now everyone knew his secrets, and the truth had set me free in ways I never could have imagined. The perfect husband had been perfectly false, But discovering that truth had led me to perfect authenticity. Marcus had thought his deception was sophisticated enough to last forever. But lies are like houses built on sand. They might look solid from the outside, but they can't withstand the storms that inevitably come. When the foundation finally crumbled, it took his entire carefully constructed world with it, leaving nothing but the truth he'd worked so hard to hide. And in that truth, painful as it was to face, I'd found everything he'd never been able to give me: genuine love, honest partnership, and a future built on trust rather than deception. His secrets had destroyed him, but they'd also revealed the person I was capable of becoming when I stopped accepting lies and started demanding the truth. Emma's third birthday brought an unexpected visitor to our door. Marcus's mother, Helen, arrived unannounced with a large wrapped present and tears in her eyes. She'd driven 6 hours from Oregon to see her granddaughter, she said, though we all knew Emma wasn't technically her granddaughter at all. The bond they'd formed during my marriage to Marcus had transcended the legal dissolution of our relationship, and Helen had maintained her connection to Emma, despite having no biological or legal claim to her. Kevin invited Helen in without hesitation, understanding that family relationships sometimes extend beyond traditional boundaries. Emma, who called Helen Grandma Cookie because of the elaborate sugar cookies she always brought, squealed with delight and ran into her arms. Watching them together, I was struck by how much genuine love could exist even in the aftermath of devastating betrayal. Helen's relationship with Emma was pure and untainted by Marcus's deceptions, built on authentic affection rather than obligation or pretense. Over coffee, Helen shared that Marcus had been arrested for fraud 2 months earlier. He'd been working at a small insurance agency in Montana and had been caught falsifying claims and pocketing the payouts. The amounts were relatively small, she said, but the pattern was clear and deliberate. He was facing federal charges and likely prison time. Helen looked exhausted as she shared this news, aged beyond her years by the constant stress of watching her son's continued downward spiral. "I keep wondering where I went wrong," she said, bouncing Emma on her lap. "How did I raise someone capable of such persistent dishonesty? Was it something his father and I did or didn't do? Was this always who he was and we just never saw it?" I found myself in the unexpected position of comforting the mother of the man who had devastated my life. But Helen wasn't Marcus, and her pain was real and undeserved. I told her what Dr. Morgan had explained to me about personality disorders, how they often developed despite loving, appropriate parenting, and how some people seemed predisposed to manipulative behavior regardless of their upbringing. David had turned out honest and decent, despite having the same parents and environment, which suggested that Marcus's problems weren't necessarily the result of their parenting. Helen stayed for dinner, and watching her interact with Kevin and Emma, I realized how much she'd lost when Marcus's deceptions were revealed. She'd not only lost the son she thought she knew, but also the daughter-in-law and granddaughter she'd genuinely loved. The ripple effects of Marcus's betrayal had extended far beyond the women he'd directly deceived to include innocent family members who'd been collateral damage in his web of lies. That evening, after Helen had returned to her hotel, Kevin and I discussed whether we should limit her contact with Emma. We'd been allowing the relationship to continue because it seemed to benefit everyone involved, but the news of Marcus's arrest raised questions about what kind of influence his family might have on our daughter's life. Ultimately, we decided to maintain the relationship while being mindful of boundaries. Helen's love for Emma was genuine, and Emma deserved to have as many people in her life who cared about her as possible. The conversation also prompted Kevin and me to discuss how we would eventually tell Emma about my previous marriage and the circumstances that had led to our meeting. She was still too young to understand complex relationship dynamics, but we wanted to be prepared with age-appropriate explanations when the time came. We agreed that honesty would be crucial, but that we'd emphasize the lessons learned and positive outcomes rather than dwelling on the traumatic aspects of the experience. 6 months later, I received a call from a literary agent who had heard about my story through Dr. Williams's research. She suggested that I consider writing a book about my experience, arguing that there was a significant audience of women who had gone through similar situations and could benefit from hearing about successful recovery and rebuilding. The idea hadn't occurred to me before, but the more I thought about it, the more appealing it became. Writing the book proved to be both therapeutic and challenging. Reliving the details of Marcus's deception and the painful process of discovery was emotionally draining, but it also helped me process aspects of the experience that I hadn't fully examined before. The act of organizing my thoughts and experiences into a coherent narrative provided new insights into my own growth and healing journey. Kevin was incredibly supportive during the writing process, taking on extra childcare responsibilities and providing feedback on early drafts. His outside perspective helped me identify patterns and significance that I might have missed as someone too close to the experience. He also helped me maintain balance, ensuring that I didn't become so absorbed in revisiting the past that I neglected our present life together. The book, titled The Perfect Lie: How I Discovered My Husband's Double Life and Built Something Better, was published 2 years later to surprising success. It resonated with readers far beyond the specific demographic of women who had experienced infidelity, speaking to anyone who had struggled with trust, authenticity, and rebuilding after betrayal. The book tour and media interviews that followed were initially intimidating, but they provided opportunities to help people who were facing similar challenges. During one book signing, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes, saying that reading my story had given her the courage to leave an emotionally abusive relationship. She'd been making excuses for her boyfriend's manipulative behavior, convincing herself that his jealousy and controlling tendencies were evidence of how much he loved her. My description of how I'd gradually learned to trust my instincts again had helped her recognize that her own discomfort with his behavior was valid and important. The success of the book led to speaking engagements at conferences about domestic abuse, relationship health, and personal empowerment. I found that I had a talent for public speaking and a genuine passion for helping others recognize and escape manipulative relationships. What had started as a personal tragedy had evolved into a platform for advocacy and education. Emma, now 5 years old, began to understand that her mother was someone other people looked up to and sought advice from. She attended a few of my local speaking events, sitting quietly in the back row and watching me address audiences of hundreds of people. Afterward, she would ask simple questions about why people were sad and why mommy was helping them feel better. Her innocent curiosity prompted conversations about kindness, helping others, and the importance of telling the truth. The financial success of the book and speaking career also provided us with opportunities we might not have had otherwise. Kevin was able to reduce his teaching load to focus more on his photography, which had always been his passion but hadn't been financially viable as a full-time career. We bought a larger house with space for Kevin's darkroom and my home office, creating an environment where we could both pursue meaningful work while maintaining our family life. Marcus's trial took place during this period, and while I didn't attend, Helen kept me informed about the proceedings. He'd initially planned to plead not guilty, apparently convinced that he could talk his way out of the charges as he'd talked his way out of so many other consequences throughout his life. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming, and his lawyer eventually convinced him to accept a plea deal. He was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. The news of his imprisonment felt surreal rather than satisfying. The confident, successful man I'd once been married to was now a convicted felon, serving time for crimes that seemed almost petty compared to the elaborate emotional fraud he'd perpetrated against multiple women. Yet I felt no vindication or pleasure in his downfall, only a distant sadness for the life he'd wasted and the people he'd hurt along the way. David visited me around this time, wanting to discuss his brother's situation and its impact on their family. He'd been struggling with guilt about cutting contact with Marcus while he was in prison, wondering if family loyalty required him to maintain some level of support, despite everything that had happened. I shared my own experience of learning to prioritize my emotional health over social expectations, encouraging him to make decisions based on what felt right for him rather than what others might expect. David also brought news that was both disturbing and enlightening. While going through Marcus's belongings to prepare his apartment for rental, David had discovered additional evidence of his brother's systematic approach to deception. There were journals dating back over a decade, detailing not just his romantic manipulations but also financial schemes, professional misrepresentations, and elaborate lies told to friends and family members. The documentation revealed that Marcus's dishonesty extended far beyond his romantic relationships to encompass virtually every aspect of his life. One particularly chilling entry described Marcus's wedding day to me, noting how successfully he'd performed the role of devoted groom, while already planning his first affair. He'd written about the thrill of maintaining such a massive deception, describing it as a game that required constant strategy and careful management. The clinical, detached tone of these entries made it clear that Marcus had never experienced genuine emotional connection with anyone, viewing all relationships as opportunities for manipulation and control. Reading excerpts from these journals was deeply unsettling, but it also provided closure in an unexpected way. Any lingering doubts I might have had about the authenticity of moments in our marriage were finally put to rest. The man I'd loved had never existed, except as a carefully crafted performance designed to manipulate my emotions and secure my compliance. Understanding this completely freed me from any remaining grief for the relationship itself, though I continued to mourn the time I'd lost and the trust that had been shattered. Emma started kindergarten around this time, and her teacher mentioned that she was remarkably perceptive about other children's emotions and motivations. She had an unusual ability to recognize when someone was being dishonest or manipulative, skills that I realized she might have absorbed from our family conversations about the importance of authenticity and truth-telling. While I didn't want her to become cynical or suspicious, I was grateful that she was developing strong instincts about people's character and intentions. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's deception had inadvertently contributed to raising a daughter who would be much harder to deceive than I had been. Emma was growing up understanding that actions needed to match words, that consistency was important, and that genuine love felt safe rather than anxious. The lessons I'd learned through painful experience were being passed on to her in a much gentler, more positive context. My work with the support group continued to be rewarding, though the stories I heard remained heartbreaking. One woman discovered that her husband had been married to someone else the entire time they'd been together, making her marriage completely invalid and her children legally illegitimate. Another learned that her partner had been systematically draining her retirement accounts to fund his gambling addiction while convincing her that they were saving for their future together. Each story reinforced my understanding of how devastating deception could be and how important it was to help people recognize warning signs earlier in the process. The most difficult case involved a woman named Patricia, whose husband had been molesting their teenage daughter while maintaining the facade of a devoted family man. Patricia's guilt and self-blame were overwhelming. She felt responsible for not protecting her child and for bringing such a dangerous person into their lives. Working with Patricia required delicate balance between validation of her pain and gentle challenges to her assumption of responsibility for her husband's criminal behavior. Cases like Patricia's reminded me that while my experience with Marcus had been traumatic, it could have been much worse. His deceptions had been primarily emotional and financial, rather than physically dangerous, and no children had been directly harmed by his actions. This perspective helped me maintain gratitude for the positive aspects of my recovery, while still acknowledging the legitimate pain I'd experienced. Emma's 6th birthday party was a milestone for our family, marking more years of her life spent in our honest, stable household than the time I'd spent unknowingly living with Marcus's deceptions. The celebration was simple but joyful, attended by friends who had supported us through various challenges and transitions. Watching Emma blow out her candles, I felt profound gratitude for the life we'd built together and the authentic relationships that surrounded us. Helen continued to visit regularly, and her relationship with Emma had evolved into something precious for both of them. Helen had channeled her grief over losing Marcus into devotion to Emma, and Emma had gained a grandmother figure who spoiled her appropriately while also teaching her valuable life skills. Helen's presence in our lives served as a reminder that good could emerge from even the most painful situations, and that family bonds could transcend legal definitions and biological connections. The success of my book led to opportunities to consult on other projects about relationship manipulation and recovery. I worked with documentary filmmakers, advised on plotlines for television shows, and contributed to academic research about the long-term effects of intimate partner deception. Each project expanded my understanding of how common these experiences were, and how much need existed for resources and support for survivors. One particularly meaningful project involved working with a technology company that was developing an app to help people identify manipulation tactics in their relationships. The app would provide education about common warning signs, offer resources for people who suspected they were being deceived, and connect users with support networks and professional help. My role was to ensure that the content was both psychologically accurate and sensitive to the emotional needs of people who might be in vulnerable situations. Kevin often accompanied me to professional events, and his support and insights continued to be invaluable. He had a talent for asking thoughtful questions that helped audiences understand complex psychological concepts, and his presence served as a living example of what healthy partnership looked like. Several attendees at my speaking events commented that seeing us together gave them hope that genuine, honest love was possible even after experiencing severe betrayal. As Emma grew older, she began to understand more about why her mother was considered an expert on relationships and trust. Her questions became more sophisticated, and our conversations evolved to include discussions about how to recognize good people versus those who might try to take advantage of her kindness and trust. I was careful to provide her with knowledge without making her fearful or cynical, emphasizing that most people were good, while helping her develop skills to identify those who weren't. The 10-year anniversary of the birthday party revelation passed with little fanfare, marked only by a brief conversation between Kevin and me about how far we'd all come since that pivotal night. Emma was thriving in school, Kevin's photography career was flourishing, and my advocacy work continued to grow and evolve. The life we'd built together was rich and meaningful, in ways that my marriage to Marcus had never been, even during the periods when I'd believed it was perfect. Marcus was released from prison after serving 2.5 years, and Helen informed me that he'd moved to a different state and was working at a car wash while living in a halfway house. She'd tried to maintain contact during his incarceration, but he'd been largely unresponsive to her letters and phone calls. The man she'd raised seemed to have disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who showed little interest in rebuilding relationships or making amends for his past behavior. The news of Marcus's release prompted some anxiety initially, though I realized quickly that I was worried more out of habit than genuine fear. He'd shown no interest in contacting me or our mutual friends since the divorce, and his criminal conviction and continued struggles with addiction made it unlikely that he would suddenly become a threat to our peaceful life. Still, Kevin and I discussed safety precautions and made sure Emma understood that she should tell us immediately if any strangers approached her or tried to engage her in conversation. My second book focused on helping people rebuild trust and create healthy relationships after experiencing betrayal, was published around this time. While it didn't achieve the same level of commercial success as the first book, it filled an important gap in available resources for people further along in their recovery journey. The first book had been about recognizing and escaping deception. The second was about the much longer, more complex process of learning to trust again and building something better. Emma, now 8 years old, had become my unofficial assistant for book events held in our hometown. She would help arrange chairs, hand out promotional materials, and greet attendees with a maturity and warmth that never failed to impress people. Her presence at these events served as a powerful visual reminder that children could thrive and grow into confident, healthy individuals, even when their mothers had experienced significant trauma and upheaval. The impact of my work had begun to extend internationally, with translations of my books appearing in several languages and invitations to speak at conferences in other countries. Each new audience brought different cultural perspectives on relationships, trust, and recovery, enriching my understanding of how these issues manifested across different societies and social contexts. The universality of deception and manipulation, and the similarly universal capacity for healing and growth, was both sobering and hopeful. One of the most rewarding aspects of my advocacy work was hearing from readers and audience members who had successfully applied the principles I discussed to improve their own lives. Some had found the courage to leave manipulative relationships, others had learned to trust their instincts more effectively, and many had simply gained confidence in their ability to recognize and demand authenticity in their personal connections. Each success story reinforced my belief that sharing difficult experiences could create meaningful, positive change for others. Helen's health began to decline when Emma was 9. And she asked if she could spend her final months living near us so she could be close to Emma. Kevin and I discussed the request extensively, considering the practical and emotional implications of having Marcus's mother become a more permanent part of our daily lives. Ultimately, we decided that Helen's love for Emma and her positive influence on our family outweighed any potential complications. Helen moved into a small apartment 10 minutes from our house and became an almost daily presence in Emma's life. She taught Emma to knit, shared stories about her own childhood and young adulthood, and provided the kind of intergenerational connection that enriched Emma's understanding of family and history. Helen's presence also gave me someone to share parenting insights with, and her perspective as someone who had raised children through different eras was often valuable and reassuring. During her final illness, Helen asked me to forgive Marcus, not for his sake but for my own spiritual well-being. She believed that carrying anger would ultimately harm me more than him, and she wanted me to find peace with the entire experience before she died. I explained to her that I had already forgiven Marcus years earlier, not because he deserved it, but because holding on to anger had been exhausting and counterproductive. My forgiveness hadn't required his repentance or acknowledgement. It had been a gift I'd given myself to facilitate my own healing and growth. Helen died peacefully in her sleep 2 weeks later, and Emma was devastated by the loss of her beloved grandmother figure. The funeral brought together family members I hadn't seen since my divorce, including David and several of Marcus's cousins who had maintained their distance during the immediate aftermath of the scandal. Marcus attended the service, looking older and more frail than I remembered, but we didn't speak beyond a brief acknowledgement. His presence felt surreal, but not threatening. He seemed like a stranger who happened to share history with me rather than someone who had once been the center of my world. Emma's grief over Helen's death was profound but healthy, and working through it together strengthened our mother-daughter bond, while also providing opportunities to discuss loss, love, and the continuing influence of people who had died. Helen had left Emma a significant inheritance, along with photo albums documenting their relationship and letters to be opened on future birthdays and milestones. Her thoughtfulness in planning for Emma's future needs was characteristic of the genuine love she'd provided throughout their relationship. The 12-year anniversary of my confrontation with Marcus passed with Emma asking more detailed questions about my previous marriage and the events that had led to our current family configuration. She was old enough now to understand the basic facts of adultery and deception, though I continued to frame the discussion in terms of learning to trust yourself and choose good people rather than dwelling on the traumatic aspects of betrayal. Emma's questions were thoughtful and showed that she was developing sophisticated understanding of relationship dynamics and human psychology. My work had evolved to include consultation with law enforcement agencies about financial fraud cases that involved intimate partner manipulation. Marcus's systematic approach to deception had turned out to be more common than I'd initially realized, and my insights into the psychological patterns of such behavior proved valuable in helping investigators understand and prosecute similar cases. Working with law enforcement provided a sense of justice that I hadn't found in the personal aftermath of my own experience, contributing to systemic changes that might prevent others from experiencing similar victimization. Kevin had achieved recognition in the photography world for his documentary series about families recovering from trauma, which had begun with photos of Emma and me during our healing process and expanded to include other families dealing with various challenges. His artistic vision captured the resilience and hope that emerged from difficult circumstances, providing visual testimony to the human capacity for growth and renewal. Several of his photographs had been exhibited in galleries, and he'd been commissioned to create a book about family reconstruction and healing. Emma's 10th birthday was celebrated with a larger party than usual, attended by school friends, neighborhood children, and the extended chosen family we'd created over the years. Watching her interact confidently with both adults and children, I marveled at how naturally she navigated social situations, and how effectively she'd absorbed lessons about authenticity and kindness. She had Kevin's gentle humor and my analytical nature, combined with a wisdom that seemed to come from growing up in an environment where truth and emotional health were prioritized above convenience or appearances. The party also marked a milestone in my own journey. It had been over a decade since I'd thought about Marcus with anything other than clinical detachment. He'd become a chapter in my personal history rather than an ongoing source of pain or concern, relegated to the same category as other formative but concluded experiences from my past. The woman who had once been devastated by his betrayal had evolved into someone for whom that betrayal was simply one event among many that had shaped her character and choices. My third book, focusing on helping children develop healthy relationship skills and emotional intelligence, was inspired by my experience raising Emma and my observation of how early education about trust and authenticity could prevent future victimization. The book addressed parents, teachers, and other adults who worked with children, providing practical strategies for building resilience and critical thinking skills without creating fear or cynicism about human nature. Emma contributed to the book project by sharing her perspective on what made her feel safe and valued in relationships, and her insights were often more profound than those of the adult experts I consulted. Her natural ability to identify inconsistencies between people's words and actions, developed through our family's emphasis on integrity, demonstrated how children could be taught to protect themselves while remaining open to genuine connection and love. The success of the children's book led to invitations to speak at educational conferences and parent groups, expanding my advocacy work into prevention rather than just recovery. Working with parents who wanted to protect their children from manipulation and abuse felt like a natural evolution of my mission, addressing problems before they developed rather than simply helping people recover from damage that had already been done. Emma began middle school with confidence and strong friendships, having learned to value substance over style in her relationships with peers. She was popular but not desperate for approval, kind but not easily manipulated, and socially engaged while maintaining her individual identity. Watching her navigate the complex social dynamics of adolescence with such wisdom and authenticity filled me with pride and gratitude for the journey that had led us to this point. The 15-year anniversary of the birthday party confrontation found me giving a keynote speech at a national conference on intimate partner abuse, addressing an audience of over 2,000 professionals who worked with survivors of various forms of relationship trauma. Standing on that stage, looking out at people who had dedicated their careers to helping others heal from betrayal and abuse, I reflected on how a single moment of courage had rippled outward to create positive change for countless people I would never meet. Marcus thought I'd never find out his secrets, but discovering them had become the catalyst for a life devoted to truth, healing, and service to others. His deception had been the foundation of his downfall, and the beginning of my transformation into someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than I ever could have become without that experience. The perfect lie had revealed perfect truth, that authentic love and genuine happiness were worth any amount of pain required to achieve them. Now everyone knew his secrets, and in the knowing we had all been freed to build something better than the beautiful lies we'd once accepted as truth. Emma's high school years passed in a blur of academic achievements, meaningful friendships, and the kind of normal teenage experiences I'd once worried she might never have. At 17, she was accepted to several prestigious universities with scholarships that reflected both her intellectual abilities and her community service work. She'd spent her junior year volunteering with a local organization that helped teenagers in abusive relationships, naturally gravitating toward work that echoed my own advocacy efforts, but with her own unique perspective and approach. The night before Emma left for college, she asked me a question that had apparently been on her mind for months. "Do you think you would have been a different mother if you'd stayed married to Marcus?" I considered the question carefully, understanding that my answer would shape how she viewed not just our family's history, but her own identity and future. "I think I would have been a more anxious mother," I told her honestly. "I would have been modeling a relationship based on pretense rather than authenticity. You would have learned that love meant accepting inconsistencies and making excuses for people's behavior. Instead, you learned that you deserve relationships where people's actions match their words." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad he showed you who he really was," she said. "Even though it hurt at the time, it led to everything good we have now." Her wisdom and emotional maturity continued to amaze me. At 18, she possessed insights about relationships and human nature that had taken me decades to develop, largely because she'd grown up in an environment where these topics were discussed openly and honestly, rather than hidden behind social conventions and polite pretenses. Kevin walked me back to our bedroom that night and found me crying, not from sadness but from overwhelming gratitude for the life we'd built together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found out about Marcus?" he asked, echoing Emma's earlier question. "I try not to think about it," I replied. "But sometimes I imagine myself still living in that beautiful prison, still making excuses for behavior that felt wrong, still teaching Emma that women should be grateful for whatever attention they receive, rather than demanding genuine love and respect." The week after Emma left for college, I received an unexpected phone call from David. Marcus had died in a car accident, driving under the influence on a rural Montana highway. He'd been alone, no other vehicles involved, and the police suspected it might have been intentional, though they couldn't prove it. David was calling to let me know about the funeral arrangements, though he understood if I chose not to attend. I felt surprisingly little upon hearing the news. No satisfaction, no relief, no renewed grief. Marcus had become so irrelevant to my daily existence that his death felt like hearing about a distant acquaintance, rather than someone who had once been central to my world. Kevin held me as I processed the information, and we discussed whether Emma should be told immediately or if we should wait until she came home for Thanksgiving. We decided to call Emma that evening. Her response was similar to mine, a kind of neutral acknowledgement followed by concern for David and Marcus's mother's family, who had remained in Oregon. "It's sad that he never figured out how to be happy," she said with characteristic insight. "But his death doesn't change anything about our lives or who we are as a family." Her words crystallized everything I had learned over the past 15 years. Marcus's death was simply the final period on a chapter that had already been closed long ago. The man who had thought his secrets were safe, who believed his deceptions were sophisticated enough to last forever, had ultimately destroyed only himself, while inadvertently creating the foundation for something far better than anything he could have built through lies. As I hung up the phone, and Kevin wrapped his arms around me, I realized that this was what victory looked like. Not revenge or vindication, but the profound peace of a life built on truth. Marcus had thought I'd never find out his secrets, but discovering them had been the beginning of discovering myself. Now everyone knew what he really was, and in that knowing, we had all been freed to become who we were meant to be. The perfect husband had been perfectly false, but his deception had led me to perfect authenticity. And in that authenticity, I had found something he never could have given me. A love that felt safe, a family that felt real, and a future built on truth rather than lies. Marcus's story was over, but ours was just beginning. The end.